That's the really tricky question.
Sorry.
No, I kind of leave that super open because there's so many different definitions of it that I like, and you're often pressured to sort of be incredibly specific about these things. But the technology, my favourite quote about, or favourite definition of technology is Ursula Le Guin's one, which is where she actually says technology is the thing you can learn how to do, which is like a slightly different way of thinking about it than all the usual definitions, which is like technology is a tool or a way of doing or a way of thinking about stuff. It's also technology, remembering that technology is an ology, like it's the study of tools, it's the thinking about tools, the thinking about doing and making things. So it's all like the frameworks of like how we act in the world. Those are like the super philosophical definitions of it, but also like practically, I mean computers. I mean the internet. I mean mostly when I'm talking about technology, I'm talking about information technology, communications technology, the internet and computers. But then I also talk about Stone Age axes and what else do I talk about? I talk about steam engines and things like this. All of these extensions of ourselves, essentially, that we build, that then go out into the world and act quite often in ways that we didn't expect. That would be my last definition of technology of many, is that it's like how we encode a certain understanding of the world into a thing, and then we go out and use that thing. But that idea then has sort of taken on this life of its own, and sometimes it can go to quite strange places without us.
So, yeah, and what you say in the intro and throughout the book is that... I can't decide what question I want to ask you now, sorry. No, this is a book that I'm actually really genuinely excited about and will go back and reread. But, so you say technology, this is about what technology is trying to tell us in an emergency. Are you up for trying to define the nature of the emergency?
I mean, the emergency is what I kind of go through quite a lot. I've wanted to write a book about the internet and maybe how great it is, but also occasionally how terrifying it is, for quite a long time. And I've always known this would be the subject of a text. When I got the opportunity and kind of set out to write this particular text, it happened really around a very specific time, a time that sort of feels like it's still going on, which was around the time of the US election, the time of the Brexit referendum, the time of, you know, a number of increasing traumas and difficulties in the world. And while I'd set out, always thought I'd write about how technology made certain things more understandable, it was also very clear that the world is becoming less understandable. And that very weird paradox, a very specific paradox, that this promise of information technology, the promise of the internet, that more and more information is available to us all the time. We live in a time when most of us, those of us who are lucky enough, certain kind of privilege, but still most of us have this incredible access to vast amounts of information. And yet what marks the world right now is increasing fundamentalisms and increasing divisions between peoples. And so that it brings into question the whole idea, which is a kind of 200 to 300 year old idea of the Enlightenment, that more knowledge about the world makes it clearer and more understandable to us. Because we've built a huge, vast, planet-spanning information system to turn as much of the world as possible into information and feed it to us constantly, and it seems to be having completely the opposite effect. So that's the kind of paradox that I wanted to think about in writing this.
And it's quite it's an unsettling paradox as well. I like the fact that you come back throughout this book to how living in this sort of encoded space makes people feel. And you talk about conspiracy theories, you talk about paranoia, but the overarching metaphor you come back to is the metaphor of the cloud, or is it a metaphor? I don't know, maybe we could unpack that right now. But I was wondering if you could tell us the story of the cloud and why this is such an important image in this book.
The first thing is this desire to stay with that feeling of being unsettled and uncertain, and thinking actually that maybe so many of these problems, these kind of fundamentalisms, these sense of division, these sense of arguments, the kind of increased ratcheting up of tension and people's inability to have, coherent conversations with one another, is possibly a result of that constant fleeing away from this feeling of discomfort of the world as it actually is, this feeling of kind of fear of not really understanding how the world is, and that those things were kind of feeding upon each other. And so, in the book I use quite a lot of meteorological metaphors, quite a lot of stories about the weather. In fact, the book starts with kind of talking about how we kind of, one of the reasons we built computers was in order to predict the weather, and there's fascinating stories in that, which we can also talk about. But this figure of the cloud I find really interesting, because for years I've been thinking about the cloud. And when I say the cloud, I mean that one that's on all the advertising posters. So Microsoft and Google and these people, they talk about the cloud. And it's sort of like this thing, this sort of like magical, furry, hairy space that's just like over there, it's fine, you don't need to think about it, magic stuff happens there.
Not a series of tubes.
Not a series of tubes. Well, that's one of the interesting things of to try and pull out these ways of thinking about it, because the cloud literally starts there as something you don't need to think about. In sort of diagrams in the 1950s, when they started to draw lines between computers and connect them up, they used to draw these little fluffy clouds to say that's like the rest of the network over there. You don't need to think about it. And that legacy of not having to think about it has stayed with us, even while the cloud has kind of enveloped everything. And it's a bit worrying when a lot of things that we maybe should be thinking about, like how financial systems work, or like how voting systems work, or how who decides what news we see, or who governs the data about our social relationships, all take place within the cloud. Maybe it's actually something we should think about. And so a lot of the work I've done in the last few years has been about pointing at the cloud, going and finding physical installations of it. So going to actual data centers, which are, the cloud is in part actually very large, boring buildings on ring roads filled with computers. That are kind of, you don't see them very often, but they're there, and they're using up huge amounts of energy. And they're costing vast amounts of money, and they're venting out all kinds of gases, and they're physical, they're solid, they're not cloudy at all.
The bit in this that really made me go, whoa, really? Well, one of them was when you say that watching, I don't know, there might by some slim chance be somebody else in this room who spends a little bit too much time hitting next episode playing in 15 seconds on one of those streaming sites, and watching a lot of maybe episodes of random stuff online instead of doing their life. But you say that the energy you spend in terms of your own broadband connection is not enough, but how much energy is it that watching an hour of streaming footage uses in the cloud?
I can't remember the kind of exact.
It's enough to run a fridge for a year or something.
The energy usage of the internet is something like 5 to 10% of global energy usage at the moment, and is only going to kind of continually grow and expand. And like all these other things that the internet does, that's just super hidden from view. It's kind of completely abstracted from us. The example of going to pointed data centers was, I was really interested in the way that banks and financial systems communicated. And so a couple of years ago I did a bike ride from Slough out to the west of London, to Basildon out to the east of London, from the site of the London Stock Exchange's data centre to the site of the New York Stock Exchange's European data centre. That's actually where most of the kind of stock exchange traffic happens, in these huge anonymous warehouses out there. And they communicate through a line of microwave dishes. And if you go between these two places, you can start looking. You can see on tall buildings where they've sited these microwave dishes. And had this kind of really extraordinary moment going through Hillingdon in the west of London, where there's a massive, great 1960s NHS hospital. One of the with ward named after Bevan, this kind of the grand public programme of British Health, under serious stress, that's crumbling and underfunded. And on top of this were these two huge microwave dishes through which billions of pounds is flowing completely invisibly every day and this private trading that's happening kind of in the atmosphere right there. And this complete invisibility that technology happens, that these financial systems were kind of very literally parasitic upon the structure of the NHS that's being defunded. But because it's hard to see, it's hard to argue about. But when you see it, right, when the cloud suddenly takes form like that, suddenly you have an incredibly powerful way of thinking about it and way of talking about it. That suddenly these kind of images become really, really clear. And that's always what I'm trying to do with technology, or what you said before about like what's technology trying to tell us. It's like you can meet it halfway and find these kind of extraordinary images and ways of talking about it.
So there is a lot. I'm fascinated by the concept. Well, all right. So to back up, as you can probably tell, like this is a book about technology with kind of a difference. It's different to a lot of the the internet's coming to kill us all books that have. I mean, they're useful, but there've been a lot of them recently. But this is kind of like it's a series of fascinating vignettes and philosophy, as well as deeply knowledgeable about technology. It's kind of because you are also an artist and you arrange ideas like an artist, and that's kind of what it's a different way of thinking about technology and about political crisis, which is why I'm really excited and just spent 6 hours on a train hotter than the underside of the sun to come and do this talk. So I mean, I'm having a good evening. I hope everyone else is too. But one of the bits that fascinates me most in here is when you talk about the grey zone and this idea of this sort of space of unknowing and political unknowing. So I was wondering if you could explain what the grey zone is, what it means to live in the grey zone, and maybe talk about Velas, because that's one of my favourite stories in the book.
Oh yeah, definitely right. And this is the bit that's like the most kind of philosophical bit of it, and it's the bit that I'm struggling mostly to write about. But it's like my answer to this constant question that I sort of pose myself in the book of like, how much do you have to know to be able to talk about this stuff? I mean, that's my real first question. That's the literacy thing that got mentioned earlier. Because I think we're in real trouble if it's only people who have like expert knowledge in this stuff are the people who engaged in conversation and debate about it. Or not even really conversation and debate, because there's none to be had if you only have one group of people who are who claim a kind of understanding and an ability to speak about these things. So the first stage is that question of literacy. Like what form of words do we need? Like what set of ideas do we need to be able to have a conversation that actually involves far more people without like everybody having to be like an actual programmer, right? How much can you talk about computers and the way they function without actually having to like go deep into the machine? Because if that's the case, then we're screwed, right? Because we need this stuff is not just about technology, it's about everything, and so we need everyone's kind of input into the thing. Where also I go, which I think is far more up for argument, is also to propose that one of the possible answers to this question of the difficulty we seem to be having with too much information, and this is a thing that I go back and forth on as well, right? Because I don't like most of the arguments you hear people talking about, like, we're being deluged by data and it's all too confusing and it's too much information. Like, people have talked about that forever, right? Socrates said that like writing was too much confusing for most people, right? And there's always been this pressure to say like people can't cope with this kind of stuff. I don't think it's a question of the amount, really, but it's a question of like at what point we think we're capable of acting ethically, morally, with justice, without having to know every single facet of the situation, essentially. That then it must be possible to kind of act morally without having to be this kind of super expert thing, which means kind of stepping back from a lot of this information.
May I read one of my favourite bits from the intro that's kind of about this, which is like when you talk about the answer, which is like everyone should learn to code. And you say, this is a good start, but learning to code is not enough, just as learning to plumb a sink is not enough to understand the complex interactions between water tables, political geography, ageing infrastructure and social policy that define, shape and produce actual life supports in society. was the other bit, and you should, the weakness of learning to code alone might be argued in the opposite direction. You should be able to understand systems without having to learn to code at all, just as one should not need to be a plumber to take a shit, nor to live without fear that your plumbing system might be trying to kill you.
Yeah, this is the thing about literacy and about this kind of metaphorical ability to have like kind of metaphorical conversation. Like plumbing is super important, it's a skilled job, and we need to have people who can do that, and they should be rewarded for having that particular skill. But we all need to know the signs of when something's wrong with the plumbing system, right? And we all have a mental model of how a plumbing system actually functions, so that we know when those danger signs kind of crop up. And so we're capable of going about our lives mostly knowing that we have a reasonably functional one, and we're going to be safe for that. But also to be able to engage in like a reasonable conversation about it when it comes up. That is what I mean, I guess, by this kind of literacy. It's a kind of an ability to discuss at that level.
Right, so tell us about Veles, because it's a great story.
Okay, the Veles story. Well, the Veles story is a very weird thing that happened around, particularly around the US election. Which is that Veles is the name of a small town in a place that's known variably as Fyrom, or the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, or just Macedonia. It's the second largest city after the capital. But basically what happened is a bunch of teenagers a few years ago, before the US election, discovered that they could make loads of money by making completely made up websites full of health tips. And running Google ads on them and making up completely ridiculous headlines for these, like 100 ways to lose weight instantly, or whatever these kind of things were. And like a few kids in this town got quite a decent amount of money out of doing this, and more kids started copying them. And a bunch of those kids then discovered in the run-up to the US election they could do the same thing by saying horrible things about Hillary Clinton, or completely made up but brilliant things about Donald Trump. And that in the weeks before the US elections, some ridiculous amount of the like kind of 15 of the top 20 most shared news stories on Facebook were coming out of this one small town in Macedonia, being completely made up by these kids, right? To the point where even Obama goes on the record at one point, like a week before the election, saying he's really worried about Veles, which is the first time almost everyone has heard of this place. And then after the election, or even kind of in the run-up to it, reporters started descending on this place and being pretty rude about these kids and saying that they were just, that they had no morals, that they were completely selfish and they didn't care, and they were just using it to buy champagne and fast cars. Which, fair enough to them. They lived in a blasted post-Soviet, unemployed mining town, and I probably spent it on fast cars too. But also, what it did was that it for me, what really happened there as well, and it's very debatable to what extent it actually affected the election, but I'm pretty sure that stories like this had a huge sway on it. But what really is super interesting to me is the way in which it was impossible to connect this story with the actual historical conditions under which those people lived. So the reason that Fyrom, Macedonia, various other names for this place, has this contested name is because when Macedonia collapsed, when Yugoslavia collapsed in the 90s and broke up into these separate republics, the people who lived in this particular area wanted to call themselves Macedonia, and they got into a huge fight with the Greeks, because the Greeks have a massive province in the north called Macedonia as well, and they were like, that's our name, it's our culture, it's our history. It's been a huge political fight that's been going on for 20 years that's just been in the news because it's maybe getting resolved, which would be nice. One of the results of that is that because the country hasn't progressed in so long, they've got increasingly right-wing governments who've created a completely fantasy history for Macedonia, where they've erected statues of Alexander the Great all over the country, who, whatever you think of the Macedonians, didn't come from there. He came from what's now northern Greece. And a bunch of these other stories, and basically created a fake news country, essentially. This is the defining official mythology of the country, has been this kind of invented history. And also you're coming out of a long period of under Yugoslavia with very strong national mythologies and a huge amount of propaganda and all those things. And so the whole thing that happened in Veles around people making fake news on Facebook is not some weird, odd product of the internet. It's a real continuation of a whole bunch of behaviours and stories of ways of thinking about the world that go much deeper and much further than that. Which is to say that there's not enough people who think about. There's not enough historical thought when we try and understand what's happening around technology. There's not enough political thought, and that seems to be a product of this weird place we've got to, where only tech people talk about technology, or like claim to be able to speak to it. That it's kind of seen as something separate from politics, seen as something separate from everyday life, and that's the thing I'm kind of constantly trying to argue against, essentially, to try and tell these stories that actually combine and kind of complicate these things again.
So what might that kind of technological literacy look like if it were just like an ordinary person who doesn't, for example, know how to code? How, like, is part of what you're doing in this book trying to, and I hate this word, but like empower people to feel more comfortable in that place of unknowing and uncertainty? I'm
sorry, I don't think that's what the book's going to do. It's
okay.
I'll be, being. One of the things I really argue against in the book is what's often termed solutionism, and what I kind of call computational thinking. And solutionism is something that's very tied, again, to the kind of thinking about technology that comes out of Silicon Valley, which is that technology will fix everything, essentially. That everything is essentially an engineering problem that can be fixed with a certain amount of kind of tinkering, or by simply the application of more technology to the problem. Computational thinking, then, for me, is what kind of, when we've so totally kind of absorbed that way of thinking into our brains that we don't even kind of realise we're doing that. But like we've become so used to that worldview, which is, again, historically this kind of enlightened worldview, that we see the whole world as something that is kind of computable and understandable in that way. And so that we fail to think of the kind of complications and the other ways of which we can understand the world. And one of those ways of understanding or thinking the world is something that can't be computed, that is inherently messy, that is inherently complicated, and requires, as a result, a different moral accounting for it, at least. That these, sorry, I was fumbling and running out of words. What I was saying is that I really set out in the book not to provide those kind of solutions, because this solutionism is the problem of this belief that we'll be able to put forward this kind of one kind of solution. What I'm doing in the book is outlining my ways of thinking about these things in the hope that it triggers people off down that path to think about it in their own ways as well.
And one of the things you point out is that because everything is so messy and feels so overwhelming, and we do have this, giant amount of information coming from all kinds of different sources, and we have increasingly few ways to tell what is true and to what extent the information we're receiving is true, people feel like they can just pick whatever version of the truth feels most comfortable. And you talk a lot about conspiracy theories. And I was wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit about the role or the danger of that kind of thinking.
I have bad internet habits, and I really love conspiracy theories because they're kind of fascinating. And I also, it's dangerous territory because it feeds into lots of really bad stuff in kind of many ways. But it's difficult because it's also people doing what I really want everyone to be doing, which is thinking about what the hell's going on, right? I quote from Frederick Jameson in the book. It's kind of a Marxist historian who called conspiracy theories like the kind of poor man's mapping of reality, which is basically just like they're attempts to write simple stories out of stuff that is properly complex and difficult. But I support the urge to try and write stories about it, right? That seems to be really important. The making sense is important. The thing that I keep talking about in the book is this thing of like how everyone is looking at the world, but seeing things like in very different ways. So I talk about a long research project I did looking at deportation flights in the UK, where the government was using these semi-secret charter planes to kind of deport people in the middle of the night. And while I was watching this, I'd often encounter other people who were watching the planes as well, for like just radically different reasons, in particular a lot of chemtrailers, if you've ever come across this.
Maybe you could explain for the non-
Chemtrailers, which I'm not going to go into very much, but chemtrailing is a very vast and kind of convoluted internet conspiracy theory about the planes, that certain planes are dumping chemicals into the atmosphere, or various things around that. It's kind of like the first major folk literature of the internet. So it's there and it's been around in the internet for a while. But what I was fascinated by was this ability of people to be looking at the same thing, which is the planes in the sky, and telling these radically different stories about it. And seeing if it's possible to make that interesting and empowering, and what about it is useful. Towards the end of the book I talk about this weird private Google conference I got invited to by accident a few years ago. Which is where Google get together with a bunch of heads of state and several senior military people and the CEOs of most of the big European companies, and they gather them all inside a place called the Grange Hotel, which is just north of Watford, and for 2 days they all sit there and talk about the world. And this is the same hotel in which 2 weeks later the Bilderberg conference takes place. They're not even trying. The Bilderberg conference, for those people who don't know, is another huge gathering of super powerful people that obsesses conspiracy theorists. Because basically, several hundred of the world's most powerful people all meet up in a private hotel, talk about how to fix the world, and burn a giant owl. The giant owl bit is weird, admittedly. But the point is, this happens.
Can we slow down the giant owl, please?
They burn a giant owl. It's a thing they do. It's like a team building exercise. I don't know. But my point is that this is how the world works. The most powerful people in the world do all get together and have these conversations. There's no conspiracy in that. My point is that you can take these different stories and you can look at them at different angles. And you can say, this is some vast conspiracy. You can say, well, no, this is how politics works. And if you can read it out in certain ways, then actually maybe you can start to affect it and talk about it. But we have to increasingly understand these as different ways of seeing the stuff. One of the other examples I give is the story of various First Nations groups in kind of northern Canada, who for years have been talking about how the planet has changed. They actually talk about the planet as moving. They say that the Earth has actually come off its axis because the sun is seen to be setting in a different place to where it's been setting for generations, for their ancestors, the way they used to see it. And for years, climate scientists have just said, climate scientists who super want First Nations people on board, right? They're you're the authentic voice of the environmental movement. But don't say that thing about the Earth being off its axis because it weirds people out, right? But actually, what they're describing is the fact that the atmosphere at higher altitudes is radically changing, and the light effects that occur across through ice and snow and increased particulation in the atmosphere is changing the look of the sun. And I don't want to go too deep into trying to say, but it's okay because it's really science, because I want to hold at a distance this ability to describe it differently, that they have a different way of seeing the world that's also valid. And our inability or the difficulty we have in holding those opposing views as equally valid, as equally worth thinking about, is also at the heart of what I think of as this kind of vast information problem. That we're constantly presented with different views, opposing pieces of information on the internet, and instead of being capable of charting a useful course between them, we're kind of torn into these states of division.
So it occurred to me reading this that one of the, in particular this section on conspiracy, the ideas about conspiracy and grey zones, is that one of the dangers, politically speaking, is not just being able to find any story to map onto problematic politics, but this conviction that somebody somewhere does know, and that's one of the that's kind of at the emotional core of conspiracy theorist thinking. that, you know, maybe you don't know everything that's going on, but somebody somewhere does. And that's also, you know, when it comes to the financial system, we're told that, you know, it's too complicated for ordinary people to possibly understand, but, you know, these very, very clever, very well-paid people, they understand it and everything's in good hands. So, I mean, do you grapple with that at all when you're thinking about, like, does anybody actually know? And is it useful to think that someone knows?
Whenever I meet, it does weirdly happen occasionally, like people in like the power, whether it was that kind of Google lot or you know, it was another kind of big internet thing recently. It was more Google and YouTube and Facebook people, but also like financial people as well. They've got no idea what's going on, and they absolutely profit from that knowledge. But they'll tell you fairly honestly that. I mean, I you know. Again, they're not like in of themselves evil or anything. Most of them, some of them probably are. But more is this question of this recurring belief that someone is in charge or someone knows what's going on, and therefore either it's not for us to speak of it, or there's some kind of devilish evil conspiracy going on. Both of which are fairly damaging positions to take ultimately. What I talk about in the book a bit about this is, and again this thing of what technology is trying to tell us in an emergency, or you know what we should understand or think about through this model of thinking about technology. Because basically, I try and take these ideas from technology and apply them to everything else. One of the things I find incredibly fascinating about the internet is that no one set out to make it. Like no one designed it. In anything resembling the form that it's come to be, and still no one has any idea what it's for. It's the dominant, like, not merely the dominant technology of our age, but it's kind of the dominant cultural mode, and the one that slowly kind of enveloped everything before it, just as kind of writing enveloped language, or like, I actually relate it more to language itself than to the technology of writing. Because it enables like almost a completely different kind of conceptual framework for thinking about the world. And yet it is this thing that was developed in very different places for different reasons that came together in certain ways that people really never expected it to. I think of it as an act of kind of unconscious generation that permits all of these other kind of things to happen on top of it. And for me that seems to be a brilliant model for thinking about the world itself. If you understand that we can build these kind of vast, fascinating structures full of endless possibility with no one intending to do it, and yet that's something that we all have experience of every single day. Like, if you can understand that, then I think it actually starts to give you a framework for thinking about these other, even more frightening systems, and actually seeing that you maybe have some kind of agency or access to them as well.